اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا بفضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So, today we'll be going over mainly ulum al-Quran, discussions of the Quran. We'll do a very, very short little part on Hadith, because we have important things to talk about in the Quran. So, we want to talk about the compilation of the Mus'haf. So if we remind ourselves, it's extremely important to remind ourselves of last lesson. If you didn't listen to last lesson, we should go back and listen to it. Extremely important. And remind ourselves as how has the Quran reached us. So the Quran, by definition, is something that is recited. So therefore, the book is not the Quran. The Mus'haf is not the Quran. It's two different things. And so we're going to be talking about the book, the Mus'haf, that helps us and gives support to the preservation of the recital, but is not actually the same thing as a recital. And at the end, we'll just touch upon some of the hadith, a topic on hadith about the highest level of hadith narrators. Does anybody have any questions from last week? No questions from last week, okay. So, the compilation of the Mus'haf, how this book was put together. So we're going to look at three eras: the time of the Prophet ﷺ himself, time of Sayyidina Abu Bakr, and the time of Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhuma. So during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the most obvious and clear way that the Quran and the Mus'haf was preserved was memorization. It's not really the Mus'haf, but ultimately that serves to create the Mus'haf. And then writing. So memorization, as we mentioned last week, the Arabs had a natural ability to memorize. Many of them memorize lots of poetry. It's quite normal. Life is simple. It's quite normal and acceptable. Assume that people memorize a lot of poetry, a lot of Quran. It's quite normal. People used to enjoy reciting the Quran. There was a tremendous reward, right, that the Prophet ﷺ said, recite the Quran, for truly it will come on Judgment Day as an interceder for its people. Its people, the people who recite Quran a lot, will have this particular intercession of the Quran. And so it's something that everybody was inclined to do naturally by virtue of the fact of being Muslims and being practicing Muslims. This is just on a kind of a personal level. On a social level, there was clearly an impetus, a social impetus to memorize the Quran. So at Uhud, when the Prophet ﷺ was burying the people at Uhud, the people who were buried first were those who had memorized the most of the Quran. Right? Similarly, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Let he who knows the most of the Book of Allah lead you in prayer." That's a social thing. Yes, it's a religious thing, of course, it's to do with people's religious practice, but ultimately that is a social impetus, a social drive to get people to memorize the Quran. So in terms of memorization of the Quran and its recital, everybody had memorized much, and many had memorized it all. Right? Everybody had memorized much. That's what the point we were making last week was, that we saw these specific chains of transmission for its accurate and precise recital, but in reality it's more widespread than that, because it's something that was just simply ambient and well known. Right? Nobody would come along and say, "Oh, there's a verse in the Quran. Oh, I never heard that verse in the Quran." Do we ever find that, ever? That a Sahabi says, "I've never heard that verse of the Quran." Never. A Sahabi might tell another Sahabi, "By the way, there's a hadith of the Prophet that he said X, Y, and Z." "Oh, I've never heard that, subhanAllah." But the Quran, everyone's heard the Quran. Everyone's heard the whole Quran many times. And so there's nothing hidden or obscure about the Quran. So that's regards to memorization, which is not really what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the book, how it was written. So Uthman ibn Affan, he says, as narrated by Abu Dawood and others, he said the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam would receive numerous surahs in revelation. When revelation would come, he would call those who wrote for him. Presumably there are people who wrote the Quran for him and wrote for him to write down these surahs in such and such and such and such a verse. So what does that mean? It means that above and beyond the Prophet ﷺ demonstrating how the Quran should be recited in order, also he was dictating to those who wrote the Quran during his lifetime of where to put the certain surahs, certain ayat. So we have memorization, we have writing in general, and also ordering of those verses very, very clearly and very carefully. And when we look at writing of the Quran during the Prophet ﷺ's life, we see a kind of an official way of it being done. The Kuttab al-Wahi or Katabat al-Wahi, like Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, for example, and others, people who used to write the Quran during the time of the Prophet ﷺ for the Prophet ﷺ. Similarly, his wives, he would do that. And then personal, people who wrote their own things. So somebody writes down Quran by themselves. They decide to do that. Right? So that's not necessarily with the knowledge of the Prophet ﷺ. It's not necessarily with the consent or the request of the Prophet ﷺ, which is a personal venture, a personal gain, personal activity. Okay, so inshallah we'll deal with your question right at the end, Atif, inshallah. Sayyidina Abu Bakr, he became the caliph, and there were wars right in the beginning, and particularly there were the Ridda wars, the wars of apostasy, meaning Muslims turned their backs and said, you know what, forget this, we're not Muslims anymore, and we are going to fight for our political freedom from this caliph thing. We're not interested, we're not going to pay zakat, we're not going to do this, not that. Among them, for example, was religious efforts to try and claim this whole Islam for themselves. For example, Musaylim al-Kadhab, who claimed to be a prophet, right? And there was a great battle of Yamama, in which more than 70 Huffaz, people who memorized the Quran, died. So Zayd ibn Thabit is narrated in Sahih Bukhari. He says, Abu Bakr called me after the massacre of Yamama, and Umar was there, and he said, Umar has come to me and told me that the massacre of Yamama was indeed intense, and that he fears that if the killing continues, much of the Quran will be lost. He feels that I should have the Quran compiled. So you can see the connection here, is that there are people who have memorized how to recite the Quran, and there might be a great reduction in those people, and there's a fear then, what if the Quran was lost completely? What if nobody had memorized the whole Quran? Now, is everybody reading the Quran from a mushaf? Is everybody relying on the mushaf? No. People relying on their memory. They're relying on their memory. So there is no mushaf, so to speak, that everybody's reading from. Okay? So he feels that I should have the Quran compiled. We should make one book which has the whole of the Quran in it. One book that has the whole of the Quran in it. Nobody has that. I objected, and I said that this was something that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam never did. It's a bid'ah. He swore by Allah that it was a good thing and kept on at me until Allah opened my heart to his suggestion. And I had the same opinion as Umar. So Abu Bakr is saying, Sayyidina Umar made the suggestion to me, make one book called the Mus'haf, called the Quran, write it out as one thing, and not in separate, disparate divided up pieces of paper. Have it all in one place and make it a standard, and have it a way of recording and way of preserving the Quran. I said, how is that possible? Abu Bakr said, how can you do something the Prophet didn't do? Sayyidina Umar kept arguing with me until eventually he said, I took his opinion. So then Sayyidina Abu Bakr says to Zayd ibn Thabit, you are a young and intelligent man, and you used to write down the revelation for the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So you used to do that. So obviously it was written during the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So follow up the Quran and gather it. I find all those pieces of paper that you wrote it all on and put it in one thing. So Zayd ibn Thabit says, I swear by Allah, were you to charge me to move a mountain, it would be no lighter for me than doing something that the Prophet that you have ordered and gathered in the Quran. I said, how can I do something that the Messenger of Allah never did? He swore by Allah that it was a good thing and kept on at me until Allah opened my heart to what Abu Bakr and Umar thought. That's what Zayd ibn Thabit said. I then followed up the Quran and gathered it all together from palm leaves, stones, and the hearts of men until I found the last surah of Surah At-Tawbah with Abu Khuzaymah al-Ansari, and I didn't find it with anybody else. Meaning what? He was the only person who knew that verse? No, he was the only person who had it written down. He was the only person who had it written down. Which is, there has come to you a messenger from among yourselves, weighty it is upon him, the troubles, etc. To the end of Surah Al-Baqarah. Al-Bara'ah, sorry. The pages were with Abu Bakr, so then he gathered it all together, basically, from all these different things, put it all together in one book, until he passed away. And then it was with Umar till the end of his life, and then with Hafsa, the daughter of Umar, Allah be all pleased with him, thereon. So what do we have then? We find now the Quran at the time of Sayyidina Abu Bakr is now written as one mushaf. There's one standard. This shows us that the perspicuity, and is not just one of the many scenarios where Sayyidina Umar has brilliant insight. It also tells us the responsibility and modesty of Sayyidina Zayd, even though he used to write the Quran for the Prophet ﷺ, having it all written down in one place, putting it all together, and making sure that this is all accurate. This is what he undertook. Okay. Now, it's narrated by Ibn Abi Dawood, the son of Abu Dawood, in his book called Al-Masahif. It's an extremely important book, but the issue is that the narrator himself, the author himself, Ibn Abi Dawood, the son of Abu Dawood, is actually a weak narrator to begin with. Right? And Abu Dawood had quite harsh words to say about his son. So the book is very, very useful and has very important, useful information in it. However, all of it is questionable by virtue of the author himself. Anyway, so it's weak then. It says in it that he, Zayd ibn Thabit, used to not accept anyone unless there were two witnesses to it. Which should make complete sense because otherwise he had seen it all written anyway. So the process was having the Quran written together from people who had all seen the Quran written in that particular way. So everybody had said, yeah, I've seen it written like that way in front of the Prophet ﷺ. We had it written this way, this was written that way, and then putting it all into one book. Putting it all into one book. Okay, now the era of Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu anhu. So now the Ummah is expanding drastically. There are Arabs and non-Arabs, more conflicts happening, and there were various problems, political and religious things happening. Hudayfa ibn Yaman and Anas ibn Malik narrates, as it comes in Bukhari, that Hudayfa ibn Yaman came to Uthman radiallahu anhuma, and he had just been fighting the Byzantines in Armenia and Azerbaijan with the people of Iraq. He had been shocked by the difference of agreement regarding how the Quran should be read. Notice how the Quran should be read, not the Quran itself. What is the issue here? Is the issue of the different qira'at. Is it wal-duha? Is it wal-duha? Is it وَلَهُمْ عَذَابٌ أَلِيمٌ بِمَا كَانُوا يَكْذِبُونَ or يُكَذِّبُونَ? It's the same Quran. No one's questioning the Quran, but how it should be recited, the subtleties of recital. And so people weren't aware that there was different ways of reciting the Quran, and there was genuine conflict, right? And there's going to be a risk of confusion and danger. What's going to happen? Hudayfa said to Uthman, O commander of the faithful, save this nation before they disagree over the Quran like the Jews and the Christians disagreed. You're going to get different sects over these different things. Make a standard. So Uthman sent a message to Hafsa to send him her copy that he may copy it and then give it back to her. So Hafsa sent it to Uthman, and he commanded Zayd ibn Thabit, Abdullah ibn Zubayr, Sa'id ibn al-As, Abdul Rahman ibn Harith ibn Hisham to copy it into mushafs. Sayyidina Uthman said to the three Qurayshites, if you and Zayd disagree over anything, then write it in the dialect for the Quraysh, for it was revealed in their dialect. How should you write it? So thus they did, and when they copied the mushafs, Quran into mushafs, Uthman sent the pages back to Hafsa, sent a mushaf to every horizon, and commanded them to burn any other Quran, be it in pages or a mushaf. So here we have now an official copies. So if you think at the time of Hafsa, you have one copy. Saying Abu Bakr's got one copy, and everyone else has there's still pieces of paper here and there, and people have their own individual copies. Here we have official copies made, which is called Al-Mushaf Al-Imam, the standard, and it's sent out to the horizons, to the main cities, and every other copy is burned. Why? In case there's inaccuracies in it. In case somebody, for example, has written a hadith in it or something like that. Okay. For example, so you'll find differences. Sometimes the Sahaba would write, for example, a dua there or these different things. So for fear of any mistake, they burnt every other copy. So Ali is narrated by Ibn Abi Dawood and others in Tafsir. For example, here narrated in Tafsir al-Qurtubi said, O people, fear Allah and be very, very wary of speaking bad about Uthman and calling him burner of the mushafs. For I swear by Allah, he did not burn them save that we, the Sahaba, agreed with him. And I swear by Allah that had I been the ruler in his time, I would have done what Uthman did. Right? And so for fear of any something that's not standardized, and why one of the reasons you have to understand something standardized is that because if you are writing your own copy, it is possible as well that you are reciting or writing a verse that has actually been abrogated. And because it's not widespread, you're not aware of that. Right? So that's another reason why you're relying on something completely solid. So where does Mus'haf come from then? The Mus'haf we have today, where does it come from? It comes from those copies that were sent out by Sayyidina Uthman. Where does that come from? That comes from the copy that comes from Zayd ibn Thabit copying the different pieces, parchments, etc., that was written in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and it is alleged, not known, but alleged, that he'd have two people witness for every single thing he put in the Quran. This is how it was written in time processing. This is how it was written in time processing. So it's written in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, copied that into one book, that copied now into many books, and then spread out. So then we have two ways that the Quran has been preserved. Two ways. The asanid, these chains of transmission we spoke about last week, with this scholar and that scholar and these different scholars all studying the fine details of how to recite Quran from various Sahaba, and then this book. So the book is kind of like, is not the core in reality. The book is a stabilizer, something there that backs it up. Because the book itself does not have all the details that are in tajweed. The book itself doesn't have all the subtleties that we know when we're reciting the Quran. So how many mushafs were there exactly? How many did Sayyidina Uthman spread out? So number of mushafs. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so how many mushafs? So according to Az-Zarkashi, late Shafi'i scholar, Muhaddith, he says that there were 4. Based on his research, there were 4. One was sent to Kufa, the major city of Kufa in Iraq. There was another major city of Basra in Iraq, and one with Damascus, one in Damascus in Syria. The other one kept with him in Medina. According to Ibn Hajar and Suyuti, there were 5. So maybe that included Fustat, for example, in Egypt. According to Abu Hatim al-Sakhtiyani, there were 7. One was to Mecca, so Damascus, Yemen, Bahrain, Basra, Kufa, and then Medina. According to Ibn al-Jazari, there were 8. He's adding maybe another, maybe again Egypt or something. So these are relevant because when we come to talk about so this is what we call al-Mushaf al-Imam. al-Mushaf al-Imam, the standardized Mushafs. So each Mushaf was sent with a reciter to recite and teach it, and there were no dots or diacritical marks. No dots or diacritical marks. So we look here, for example. Can you read this? Can I read this? This is pretty hard. This is actually later. This is probably about 100 years later or more in reality, of how it was written, but it's close to how they were written back then. So when you read this, like, hang on a minute, I can't read the words. Right? So in reality, you can read it. It just takes a bit of work, that's all. But the important thing is there are no dots. So a fa and a qaf look the same. Right? And so that is basically, that's where we get to that stage. So this is what it looks like, something like that. Right? Okay? Any questions there? Okay? No questions, Altif? Anybody else? Any questions? So can everyone have a conception of where are we right now with the Mus'haf? We have a Mus'haf, a book, which is one thing. That's one way the Quran's reached us. Another way the Quran's reached us through tawatur, mass transmission of the mass transmission of narrators. Now they're not the same. One is very there's no commentary, that's true, and there's no tashkil, there's no this, no that. So there's a level of great grayness around it with the Mus'haf. The other thing is very, very accurate because it has this pronunciation, right? Okay, no questions, great. So now we're going to go on to Hadith, to the topic of Hadith, just very briefly. So first of all, answering your question, Atif, how weak can a Hadith be to act upon? So number one, we don't act upon a Hadith independently, right? So we don't act upon a Hadith independently. So there's no evidence for this case whatsoever, and there's a weak Hadith to back they're not backing anything. It's just completely independent. Then it's it's fairly useless. So when do we use a weak hadith? We use a weak hadith when it's not super weak. It's not super weak, and there is other evidence to back that idea, either through analogy of the Quran from the Sunnah or other hadith to that same effect. For example, Imam al-Shafi'i, he says that if you have an injury, for example, I cut my finger off, for example, may Allah protect me, and I need to make wudu, what do? So Imam Shafi says you do the following. You wash your face, you wash your arm as much as possible, you wipe over that bandage, for example, that's there, and then you do tayammum, and then you complete your wudu. Where does that come from? Where does that come from? That comes from a weak hadith in Abu Dawood that Imam Shafi narrates as well, and many other people. So Imam Shafi is before Abu Dawood, 100 years or so before. Not quite 100 years, but 3 generations before him. And quotes the hadith that there was a Sahabi who was on jihad with the other Sahaba, and a rock ended on his head, and he had a very bad injury on his head, and he needed to make ghusl. So they asked the Sahaba, what should I do? I need to make ghusl. He said, well, you have water, so you have to make ghusl. So he made ghusl, and he got infected, and he got sick, and he died. And so then the Prophet ﷺ, so when they went back to the Prophet ﷺ, told him, he got very angry, and he said, why did they do that? They should, if they didn't know what to do, they should have asked. إِنَّمَا شِفَاءُ الْعَيِّ السُّؤَالِ, the only cure for ignorance is to ask. And then the Prophet ﷺ said he could have just made ghusl, and then made tayammum, right? Made ghusl, but put a bandage on, wipe over the bandage, and make tayammum. So we notice that Imam Shafi'i doesn't know the answer. He doesn't know what you do when you have an injury. However, he does know a principle, which is try your best, right? So try your best. So do everything you can do. So can you make a full ghusl or wudu? No, because I have an injury. Okay, well, can you make tayammum? So, well, possibly. Okay, well, then try your best. Do both things. So Imam Shafi'i already has in his head this principle. The principle is already there. Try your best. Along comes a weak hadith, and he says, that is backing up the idea already in my head. Let's go with it. Right? Let's go with it. And so then that is that backs up that same point. I apologize. So how weak can it be? It has to be mildly weak, meaning it's a 50-50 hadith, not something like 40-60 or 30-70, meaning most likely it's weak. And there's already evidence to back it up. So usually, and so that's always the case in reality, Atif. You don't really have a discussion that has nothing with it. And you always have a discussion that goes with it. Okay. And so there's always evidence from analogy. There's already other evidence from fatwa, Sahaba, etc. Seldom do you have something just by itself like that in the middle of nowhere. Okay. Is that clear, Atif? Okay. And in reality, how weak is something that doesn't really make any sense until you get involved in critiquing the hadith themselves and get familiar with hadith narrators themselves, right? Because it's kind of like what does that mean? How weak? You know, it's like it doesn't really mean much. When you actually get involved, you get a better taste of what weakness means, and then once you get into that, it gets a better kind of idea. Okay, yeah. Okay, so just very, very briefly, the highest levels of hadith narrators. So we have good hadith narrators, excellent hadith narrators, okay hadith narrators, and bad hadith narrators, and then liars, right? Approximately 5 levels of a hadith narrator. However, the hadith is not just coming from one hadith narrator. It's coming from one hadith narrator narrating from somebody else. So we have, let's say, 5 variables based on how good you are. Excellent, good, acceptable, not so good, liar, right? And then we add to that who's narrating from who. And so when we add to that, we also have to look at the relationship between these 2 narrators. How often did this person narrate from that other person? So in reality, given that we're dealing with humans and human behavior, we're not dealing with robots or kind of data that's just out there. So we're dealing with people who visited people, who studied with people. So you have people, someone like Al-Humaydi. So Al-Humaydi, he is one of the teachers of Bukhari. The first hadith in Bukhari is narrated from Humaydi, narrates from Sufyan ibn Uyayna. Now Humaydi spent something like 30 years with Sufyan ibn Uyayna. So Humaydi is a good narrator. Sufyan ibn Uyayna is a good narrator. But it's not just a good narrator from a good narrator. It's a good narrator from a good narrator, and these 2 people were together for 30 years. So the possibility of Humaydi making a mistake in what he narrates from Sufyan is fairly irrelevant, fairly insignificant. It's insignificant. It's just not going to happen, right? As opposed to when you have a good narrator from a good narrator, but these 2 people didn't spend much time together, right? So what we can do then is we can have good, or excellent, plus the fact that the connection between these 2 people is excellent, right? So when you're looking at Bukhari and Muslim, what does Bukhari do? Bukhari is about choice selections of Sahih hadiths, fantastically Sahih hadiths. What's he looking for then? He's looking for good narrator from good narrator, or excellent narrator from excellent narrator, ideally, and particularly looking for the relationship between these two people. That these people spent a long time together, right? And so we get something like the best narrators from the best narrators from the best narrators, right? And so this is what we will see. So something like, for example, Ibn Qasim, right? Ibn Qasim is a student of Imam Malik in fiqh. He spent ages, like 20 years with Imam Malik. So he's heard the Muwatta of Imam Malik hundreds of times. So when he narrates the Muwatta of Imam Malik, it's not really a question of authority. There's authenticity. It's just it's heard so many times that there's no real room for error. So you have somebody as good as Ibn Qasim narrating from Imam Malik, right? And you have someone like Imam Malik narrating from Az-Zuhri, and someone like Zuhri narrating from Abu Salama, and someone like Abu Salama narrating from Abu Huraira. So they're not just really good narrators, but their connection between them is very strong. And so the room for error is extremely rare. As opposed to good narrator from a good narrator, or an excellent narrator from an excellent narrator, but who didn't spend that much time together. Right? So somebody, for example, like Al-A'mash. Al-A'mash is a fantastic narrator. He might narrate from Mujahid, student of Ibn Abbas, was a fantastic narrator. But in reality, the amount of the hadith that he narrates from him directly around 10. Right? Okay, so it's not really, the connection is not very strong at all. And in fact, most of the hadiths that A'mash narrates from him are not from him in reality. It's all indirect, it's all, something else. So the connection isn't strong. Right? So what Bukhari will do, generally speaking, when he's trying to prove a point, he's going to try and find choice cut, meaning excellent from excellent, and the relationship in these two people is very strong. Or excellent from excellent, and the relationship is good. This person is not from the main students of this teacher, but he's from, for example, the main ones. Not the main ones, but the main ones. Right? And that's how it will go down. Quality of narrator, he's excellent, he's good, he's acceptable, he's not very good, he's actually a liar. Right? These kind of 5 layers approximately, and you might have more. And then approximately the circles of closeness. Is this a person who spent a long time and knows the hadith very well, or long time and yes, or somebody who was there, for example, for a month, or somebody who was there just once, and then somebody who may or may not have narrated from that person. So for example, what you'll generally find then is in Bukhari and Muslim, you'll find the first 2 levels. Right? If you could break them approximately into like kind of 5 levels, first top 2 levels. And in Muslim, you find level 1, level 2, and level 3. So there will be certain hadith in Muslim that's not really on the standards of Bukhari. It's fine, there's nothing wrong with it, but it's not on that same level, right? And then you go down levels, you're going to get to levels of, for example, Tirmidhi and Nasa'i, and then Nasa'i and Abu Dawood, etc. And you're going to go down, right? And so generally speaking, then in something like Bukhari and Muslim, you won't find any bad narrators. If you found a bad narrator, in reality, it would only be there in virtue of the fact, well, 2 reasons basically. If he's number 1, because in this scenario he's not being used alone. Right, so you have a bad narrator narrating a hadith, but he is not the only person. There might be 2 people narrating the same hadith. In reality, he's just backing it up. He's not being relied upon. Right? They use the phrase "rawalahu maqrunan." They narrated him along with other narrators. They're not really relying on him exactly. Or it could be that this particular person, he's not that good, but he's good when he's narrating from so and so. So he's not that good in general, but when he narrates from so and so, he is good. Like he's not that fantastic narrator, but this is his teacher who he spent a long time with. Right? But it's rare to find things like that. Right? Yeah. And yeah, that's the general picture. But generally speaking, you find these top 2 levels. In Bukhari and Muslim, top 2 levels. In Muslim, the top 3 levels. Okay? Any questions or queries there? No questions, Altif? Okay, inshallah. We'll stop here, inshallah ta'ala. And we'll see you next week, inshallah. Okay, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Subhanallah bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant.